You need to grab your things and move to the back. Now, first class isn't for people like you." The words hung in the stale cabin air like a toxic cloud. Captain David Sterling, a man who had landed damaged jets in hurricanes and trained hundreds of pilots, froze. He looked at the flight attendant, Patricia, whose name tag gleamed under the cabin lights, her finger pointing toward the cramped rows of economy. He was wearing his full uniform, 4 stripes on the shoulder, and yet, to her, he was just an imposter. David felt the eyes of every passenger burning into him. He tightened his grip on his cap. He knew the regulations better than anyone on this plane. He knew he could shut this flight down with a single phone call, but he also knew what happens when a black man loses his temper in an enclosed metal tube. "Are you deaf?" she snapped, snapping her fingers near his face. "Move, or I call the marshals." David smiled, a cold, dangerous smile. "Okay, Patricia," he whispered. "I'll move, but you better pray this plane flies itself today." The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Terminal 4 at JFK International Airport. It was a miserable Tuesday evening in November, the kind of weather that delayed flights, soured moods, and made the smell of wet wool and stale coffee hang heavy in the boarding area. Captain David Sterling stood near the window, watching the ground crew struggle with the baggage carts in the downpour. He checked his watch, a vintage Breitling Navi timer, a gift from his father after his first solo flight 30 years ago, 1845, Flight 299 to London. Heathrow was already 30 minutes behind schedule. David wasn't flying the plane today. He was deadheading aviation slang for an airline crew member, flying as a passenger to get to another airport for a flight assignment. He was scheduled to captain a Boeing 777 from London to Dubai the following evening. He was exhausted. He had just finished a grueling 3-day simulator check, certifying new pilots on emergency procedures. His eyes burned, and his lower back ached. All he wanted was the comfort of Seat 2A in first class, a glass of warm water, and 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep. He adjusted his tie, even when deadheading. David took pride in the uniform, the double-breasted navy blazer, the pristine white shirt, the gold wings pinned perfectly straight above his left pocket, and the 4 gold stripes on his epaulets that signified the rank of captain. Not just any captain, but a senior Czech airman for transatlantic airways. In the hierarchy of the sky, David was royalty. But as he approached the gate, he didn't feel like royalty. He felt the familiar, prickly sensation of being watched. Zone 1 First Class and Diamond Medallion members, you are welcome to board, the gate agent announced. David picked up his leather flight bag and joined the short queue. Directly in front of him was a man in a grey tracksuit, chewing gum loudly, scrolling on his phone. The man looked like he had just rolled out of bed. The gate agent scanned the man's phone without a second glance. "Have a nice flight, Mr. Pendergast." David stepped up next. He smiled warmly at the agent, a tired-looking young woman. "Good evening." He handed over his paper boarding pass, marked, "Must ride, crew." The agent scanned it. The machine beeped a distinct, angry red tone. She frowned, tapping her keyboard. "One moment, Captain Sterling. The system it's showing a seat conflict." David sighed internally, but kept his face impassive. "Is there a problem? I confirmed the booking this morning. Seat 2A. Before the agent could answer, a voice cut in from the jet bridge door behind her. "What's the hold-up? Sarah, we're already late." A woman stepped out. She was tall, with hair dyed a severe shade of blonde that clashed with the harsh fluorescent lighting. Her uniform was immaculate, but her expression was sour, her lips pursed in perpetual annoyance. Her name tag read, Patricia Holloway. Purser, Sarah, the gate agent, looked nervous. "Patricia, the system is flagging this gentleman's seat. It says double booked." Patricia's eyes slid over David. She didn't look at the 4 stripes on his shoulder. She didn't look at the wings. She looked at his face, then his hands, and then she let out a short, dismissive huff. "It's not a glitch," Patricia said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension. "We need seat 2A for a revenue passenger. Mr. Whitlock is a Diamond member. We can't have non-revs taking up premium space when we have paying customers on the wait list." David straightened his posture. "Excuse me. Patricia, I'm not just a non-rev. I'm deadheading to operate a flight out of Heathrow. My contract guarantees a first-class rest seat for flights over 6 hours. It's a safety requirement." Patricia crossed her arms. She stood in the doorway, physically blocking the path to the plane. "I know the rules, sir. And the rule is that paying customers come first. Always. The flight is full. If you want to get to London, you'll take what's available." David took a slow breath. He had dealt with turbulence, engine failures, and bird strikes. He could handle a rude purser. "I suggest you check the manifest again. My status is must ride. If I don't get rest, I can't fly the return leg. That cancels a flight in London. Is that what you want?" Patricia stepped closer, invading his personal space. She lowered her voice, but it was loud enough for the people in line behind David to hear. "Listen to me. I don't care what you think you are. I have a very important guest who needs that seat. You can either take seat 38B in economy, or you can stay in New York. I really don't have time to argue with affirmative action hires." The slur was subtle, coded, but it hit David like a physical blow. The air around them seemed to freeze. Behind David, a passenger shifted uncomfortably. "Hey, come on," a man's voice said. "He's a captain. Isn't he let him board?" Patricia snapped her head toward the line. "This is a security matter regarding airline protocol. Please wait your turn." She turned back to David, a smirk playing on her lips. "Well, 38B, middle seat, near the toilets. Take it or leave it." David looked at her. He saw the malice in her eyes. It wasn't about the seat. It was about power. She wanted him to explode. She wanted him to yell, to wave his hands, so she could call security and have him dragged off as an unruly passenger. He had seen it happen to others. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. 38B, David repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "Fine." Patricia grabbed his boarding pass, tore it in half, and scribbled 38B on the stub with a red pen. She shoved it into his chest. "Board the aircraft. And try not to disturb the first-class passengers on your way back. They paid to be there." David picked up his bag. He walked past her, his shoulder brushing against the wall to avoid touching her. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, the cold, damp air hit him. But it was nothing compared to the chill running down his spine. He was on the plane. But the war had just begun. Entering the Boeing 777 usually felt like coming home for David. He loved the smell of the recycled air, the hum of the auxiliary power unit APU, the organized chaos of the galley. But tonight, it felt like entering a hostile territory. He stepped through the L2 door. To his left was the sanctuary of first class. To his right, the long, crowded tunnel of economy. Patricia was already inside, directing traffic with the efficiency of a prison warden. She spotted David instantly. "Right." She pointed down the aisle. "Keep moving, all the way back." David began the walk. It was a long walk on a 777-300. He had to pass through the business class mini cabin, then premium economy, and finally into the main cabin. As he walked, he felt the gaze of the passengers. A man in a pilot's uniform walking past the cockpit, past first class, and heading deep into economy was a rare sight. It signaled something was wrong. "Is the pilot sitting with us?" A teenager with headphones asked his friend loudly. "Maybe he's in trouble." The friend laughed. "Maybe he crashed the last one." David kept his eyes forward, his jaw set tight. He clutched his flight bag, which contained his iPad, his headset, and his logbook, the documentation of his 15,000 hours of flight time. He reached row 38. It was exactly as Patricia had promised. The last row before the rear galley and the lavatories. The seats didn't recline fully because of the bulkhead wall behind them. The air was thick with the chemical smell of the toilet disinfectant. Seat 38B was a middle seat. In 38A, by the window, sat a large man who was already asleep, his elbow encroaching well over the armrest. In 38C, the aisle seat, sat a young mother with a toddler on her lap. The toddler was screaming, face red, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I'm so sorry," the mother said, looking up at David with exhausted eyes. "He's teething. I can't get him to stop." David's heart softened. He wasn't angry at the passengers. He smiled gently. "Don't apologize, Mum. We've all been there." He squeezed into the middle seat. It was a tight fit. His broad shoulders, accustomed to the spacious flight deck, were jammed between the sleeping man and the frazzled mother. He had to place his flight bag under his legs because the overhead bins were stuffed with winter coats and duty-free bags. He sat there, knees pressed against the seat in front, his uniform jacket feeling stiflingly hot. 10 minutes later, boarding was complete. The door closed announcement came over the PA. David looked up the aisle. Through the gap in the curtains, he could see all the way to first class. He saw Patricia fluffing a pillow for the man in 2A, his seat. The man, Mr. Whitlock, was a heavy-set guy with a red face, laughing loudly at something Patricia said. She poured him a glass of champagne, leaning in close, her hand lingering on his shoulder. Then, Patricia grabbed the intercom handset. Her voice boomed through the cabin. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Flight 299 to London. We have a full flight tonight, so we ask for your patience. We also want to remind everyone to stay in their assigned cabins. Economy passengers are strictly forbidden from using the first-class lavatories at the front. Thank you." David knew that announcement was for him. It was a petty, final jab. He closed his eyes and tried to meditate, a technique he used before difficult approaches. Focus on the breath. Ignore the noise. The plane pushed back. The safety video played. The engine spooled up the deep, powerful roar of the GE90s. David knew that sound better than his own heartbeat. He could tell by the vibration that the number 2 engine was running slightly rougher than number 1, likely a fan blade balance issue. Nothing dangerous, just a quirk. They taxied out to runway 31L. The takeoff roll was long and heavy. The plane shuddered as it lifted off the wet tarmac and pierced the low cloud layer. Once the seatbelt sign chimed off, the service began. David was thirsty. His throat was parched from the stress and the dry cabin air. He waited for the drink cart. It took 45 minutes for the cart to reach row 38. It was being pushed by a young flight attendant, a girl who looked like she was on her first month of flying. Her name tag read Jenny. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked the mother in 38C. "Pasta, please," the mother said. Jenny handed over the tray, then looked at David. Her eyes widened when she saw the 4 stripes. "Oh, Captain, I didn't know we had a captain back here. Can I get you anything?" "Just water, please," David said. "And maybe a coffee if you have it." "Of course, sir. Actually, let me see if I can get you a meal from business class. We usually—" Jenny, Patricia's voice, cracked like a whip. She appeared from the rear galley, looming over the cart. "What are you doing?" Patricia hissed. "He's a captain." "Patricia, I was just going to—" "He is a passenger right now," Patricia interrupted, staring daggers at David. "And we are short on business class meals. He gets the economy meal like everyone else. Chicken or pasta." "Sir." David looked at Patricia. The sheer pettiness was astounding. "I'm not hungry," David said quietly. "Just the water." Patricia grabbed a small plastic cup, filled it halfway with lukewarm water from a jug, and slammed it onto his tray table. Water splashed onto his uniform cuff. "Oops," she said. "Deadpan. Turbulence. Watch yourself." She shoved the cart forward, forcing Jenny to move on. "Keep moving, Jenny. We don't have time to chat with deadheads." David wiped the water off his sleeve with a paper napkin. He watched Patricia walk away, her hips swaying with arrogant triumph. He checked his watch. 7 hours to go. He leaned his head back against the hard seat. He didn't know it yet, but Patricia's arrogance was about to cost her more than just a complaint letter. The plane was cruising at 35,000 feet over the dark Atlantic. The air was smooth. The cabin lights were dimmed. Most passengers were asleep. But up in the cockpit, something was going wrong. David felt it first, a subtle shift in the plane's angle of attack, a slight reduction in engine power that didn't match the cruise profile. His eyes snapped open. He sat up straight, his senses on high alert. The plane banked slightly to the left, then corrected sharply to the right. It wasn't turbulence. It was a control input, a sloppy one. "What are you doing up there?" David thought. Then, the chime sounded. Ding-dong. The call button from the cockpit to the cabin crew. Then it rang again. Ding-dong. Ding-dong. Emergency priority. The cabin lights flooded on, blindingly bright. The passengers groaned, shielding their eyes. Patricia came running down the aisle from the front, her face pale, her composure gone. She wasn't looking at the passengers. She was sprinting toward the back galley to grab the interphone. David unbuckled his seatbelt. He knew. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it was bad. Patricia grabbed the phone. She listened for a second. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost under the harsh LED lights. She dropped the phone. It swung on its cord, banging against the metal wall. She turned around, her eyes wide with terror, scanning the cabin, looking for him. David stood up in the aisle. He was 6'2", and in that moment, he looked like a giant. He looked straight at Patricia across the rows of sleeping passengers. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice projecting clearly over the hum of the engines. Patricia stammered, her voice trembling so hard she could barely speak. The captain," she choked out. He's slumped over. He's not moving. And the first officer, he says he can't see. He says his eyes are burning." A murmur of panic started to ripple through the back rows. David stepped out of the row. Get out of my way, he told the passengers. He walked toward Patricia. The anger was gone. The humiliation was gone. Now, there was only the mission. Take me to the front, David ordered. Patricia nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face. Please help us. David didn't wait for her. He started walking fast up the aisle, toward the cockpit, toward the crisis that was waiting behind the reinforced steel door. The walk from row 38 to the front of the aircraft felt like running through quicksand. The cabin was eerily quiet, the passengers oblivious to the chaos unfolding behind the reinforced door. Save for the few who had seen Patricia's terrified face. David moved with a purposeful stride, his eyes fixed on the bulkhead, as he passed through the curtain separating economy from business class. The air quality changed. It wasn't just the smell of expensive perfume and warmed nuts anymore. There was something else, a faint, acrid tang. Electrical, David thought. Ozone and melting plastic. He knew that smell. It was the smell of a pilot's worst nightmare. Patricia was fumbling with the keypad on the cockpit door. Her hands were shaking so violently she kept missing the numbers. "Calm down," David said, his voice low and commanding. "Breathe. Enter the code." I can't remember the emergency code," she sobbed, panic seizing her throat. David gently moved her hand aside. He knew the universal override code for transatlantic airways. He punched it in 299 star. The lock clicked. The red light turned green. David pushed the door open, and a wall of thick, grey smoke billowed out, stinging his eyes instantly. "Oh my God," Patricia screamed, covering her mouth. The cockpit was a scene from hell. The master warning alarm was blaring a piercing, repetitive chime that drilled into the skull. Ding, ding, ding! Ding, ding, ding! The captain, a man David recognized vaguely as Captain Miller, was slumped forward against the yoke the control column. His body weight was pushing the nose of the plane down, sending them into a slow, terrifying dive. In the right seat, the first officer, a young man named Kenji, was wrestling with the controls. He had his oxygen mask on, but he was coughing violently. He was blindly swatting at the panel. "I can't see!" Kenji was yelling into his mask, his voice distorted by the microphone. My eyes. The extinguisher. It blew back. A fire extinguisher lay on the floor. Empty. White powder coated everything: the instruments, the windows, the pilots. The source of the smoke seemed to be the captain's side console, a charred, melting lump of what used to be an iPad battery. It had gone into thermal runaway, exploding and filling the small space with toxic fumes. The plane was banking hard to the right. The artificial horizon showed them dipping past 30 degrees of bank. The overspeed warning began to click. Click, click, click. They were diving. David didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He reacted. He grabbed Patricia by the shoulder and shoved her backward into the galley. "Stay there, do not let anyone in." He stepped into the smoke-filled cockpit and slammed the door shut behind him. He reached over the slumped body of Captain Miller and grabbed the captain's yoke. He pulled back hard, fighting the dead weight of the unconscious man. "I have controls," David roared, his voice booming over the alarms. Kenji, blinded and panicked, didn't release his grip. "Who is that? Who's there? It's Captain Sterling, check airman. I have controls." "Kenji, let go." The authority in his voice cut through the panic. Kenji released the yoke. David hauled back on the column. The G-force pressed him into the floor as the nose of the massive Boeing 777 pitched up. Arresting the dive, he leveled the wings, scanning the instruments through the haze, Altimeter 28,000 feet and climbing. Speed 320 knots. They were safe. For now. David reached for the spare oxygen mask stored behind the observer's seat. He strapped it over his face, inhaled a deep lungful of pure, cool oxygen, and flipped the regulator to 100%. He keyed the mic. "Kenji, can you hear me? Loud and clear." Kenji wheezed. "Captain Sterling, is that really you?" "It's me. What's the status? Captain Miller." His EFB electronic flight bag exploded. He tried to grab it, and the fumes. He passed out instantly. I used the Helon, but the spray, it blinded me. I can't read the PFD primary flight display. David looked at Miller. The man was unconscious, his face a sickly shade of grey. He needed medical attention immediately. But there was no room to move him, and no one to fly the plane if David left the seat. "Okay," David said, his voice calm and rhythmic. "We need to get this smoke out. I'm initiating the smoke/fumes removal checklist. I need you to monitor the radio." David reached up to the overhead panel. He flipped the recirculation fans off. He opened the outflow valves manually. The sudden pressure change sucked the grey cloud out of the cockpit, clearing the air. The alarms were still blaring. David silenced them one by one. The silence that followed was heavy. He looked at the empty seat, the jump seat behind him. He needed help. He couldn't fly the plane. Talk to ATC, run the checklists, and monitor the unconscious captain all at once. He unlocked the cockpit door. Patricia was standing there, trembling, holding a pot of coffee she had mindlessly picked up. She looked at David, this man she had sent to the back of the plane, this man she had insulted. He was now sitting in the captain's seat, wearing the mask, his hands firmly on the controls that were keeping them all alive. David pulled his mask to the side for a brief second. "Get in here," he ordered. "Now." Patricia stepped into the cockpit, her knees knocking together. The smell of burnt lithium and fire extinguisher powder was overwhelming. She saw Captain Miller slumped unconscious, foam at the corners of his mouth. She saw the white powder coating the dashboard, and she saw David. He looked different. In the cabin, he had been just a passenger, a nuisance she could bully. Here, surrounded by glowing screens and switches, bathed in the amber light of the instrument panel, he looked like a titan. He was in his element. "Sit," David commanded, pointing to the observer's jump seat. Patricia collapsed into it. Is he dead?" she whispered, looking at Miller. "He's breathing, but barely. Oxygen deprivation," David said, his voice amplified by the mask speakers. "We are diverting. We can't make London. The electrical system on the left side is compromised." He turned his head slowly to look at her, through the clear visor of his oxygen mask. His eyes were piercing. "I need you to be useful. Patricia, can you do that?" She nodded frantically. Yes. Captain. Anything. Good, because you're about to earn your paycheck." David keyed the radio. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Transatlantic, 299. We have had a fire in the cockpit. Captain is incapacitated. First officer is visually impaired, requesting immediate diversion to St. John's. We are currently level 280. The voice of Gander Oceanic Control crackled back instantly. "Transatlantic 299, Roger, Mayday. St. John's is currently reporting severe weather, low visibility, freezing rain. Do you have an alternate?" David cursed under his breath. St. John's was the closest land. Halifax was too far. Returning to New York was impossible with the wind. "Negative. Center," David said. "We have a medical emergency and a flight control issue. We are committing to St. John's. Roger. 299. Cleared direct St. John's. Descend and maintain flight level 200. Good luck. David turned to Patricia. You see this book? He pointed to a thick, yellow-tabbed binder wedged next to the seat. That's the QR. Itch. Quick reference handbook. Grab it. Patricia's hands shook as she pulled the heavy binder out. Open to the section marked Electrical Bus Failure, David ordered. I don't know how to read this, she stammered. Flight attendants were trained in first aid and evacuation, not complex systems troubleshooting. David's patience snapped. He didn't yell, but his tone dropped an octave, becoming deadly serious. Patricia, look at me. She looked up, eyes wide with fear. An hour ago, you told me I wasn't good enough to sit in seat 2A because of the color of my skin. You told me I was an affirmative action hire. Do you remember that? Patricia flinched as if slapped. I didn't mean. You meant every word. David cut her off. But right now, that affirmative action hire is the only thing standing between you and a watery grave in the North Atlantic. So you are going to listen to me, and you are going to do exactly what I say. Not because you like me, but because you want to live. Do you understand? Tears welled up in her eyes. The shame burned hotter than the fire. She looked at the man she had judged, the man she had tried to humiliate. He wasn't angry. He was focused. He was saving her life. I understand, she whispered. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Save it for the debrief, David said coldly. Right now, read the checklist. Item 1. Bus tie breaker. Open. Look for the switch marked BTB1. For the next 20 minutes, the cockpit was a symphony of tension. David flew the massive jet with one hand, manipulating the complex overhead panels with the other, guiding Patricia through the switches. No, not that one. The one above it. Yes. Click it off. Good. Next. Utility galley power. Off. Patricia worked through the tears. She saw the complexity of the machine. She saw the immense skill required to keep it in the air. She watched David's hands steady, precise, gentle. Every movement was calculated. She realized, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that she had treated a master of his craft like a servant. Captain, Kenji spoke up from the right seat. He had wiped his eyes, but they were red and swollen shut. I have the frequencies set for the ILS approach, but I can't see the runway. You're on your own for the landing. Understood, David said. The weather radar painted a nasty picture. A massive storm cell was sitting right over Newfoundland. Red and magenta blobs covered the screen. Turbulence. Hail. Wind shear. Patricia, David said. Go back to the cabin. Secure everything. Tell the passengers we are making a precautionary landing due to a technical issue. Do not mention the fire. Do not panic them. And tell the other flight attendants to prepare for a possible evacuation on landing. Yes, Captain, she said. She unbuckled, her legs wobbly. And Patricia. She paused at the door. When you come back, bring me that water you spilled on me. I'm thirsty. It was a small comment, but it hit its mark. It reminded her that he remembered everything. She nodded, shame coloring her cheeks crimson. Yes, sir. She left the cockpit. As she walked back into the cabin, she saw Mr. Whitlock in seat 2, a David seat. He was complaining loudly to another flight attendant. My champagne is warm, and why is the plane turning? I demand to know what's going on. Patricia looked at the man. He was petty. He was rude. He was exactly the kind of person she usually pandered to. But now, he just looked pathetic. She walked past him, ignoring his empty glass. She grabbed the interphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the purser. We are diverting to St. John's. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride." She walked back to row 38. She looked at the empty middle seat where she had forced David to sit. She realized then that the hierarchy of the world was fake. The uniform, the first-class ticket, the platinum status. It all meant nothing when the engine caught fire. The only thing that mattered was competence. And she had just declared war on the most competent man on the plane. She returned to the cockpit with a bottle of water. She handed it to David without a word. "Strap in, Patricia," David said, taking a sip. "And pray." The plane shuddered as they hit the first wall of the storm. The wind howled against the windshield. Rain lashed the glass like bullets. Below them, the dark, freezing ocean waited. David gripped the yoke. "Gear down. Flaps 20. The floor dropped out from under them. They were descending into the abyss. The Boeing 777-300ER, a technological marvel of aviation weighing nearly 300 tons, was now a leaf in a hurricane. St. John's International Airport, YYT, in Newfoundland, is notorious among pilots. It sits on the edge of the North Atlantic, a rock in the ocean where weather systems go to die. Tonight, it was living up to its reputation. The ATIS Automatic Terminal Information Service reported winds from the northwest at 45 knots, gusting to 60. Visibility was a half-mile in freezing rain. The ceiling, the bottom of the clouds, was at 200 feet. That meant David wouldn't see the ground until he was 20 seconds from impact. "Flaps 25. David ordered, his voice tight but controlled. Kenji, still unable to see clearly through his swollen, tearing eyes, reached for the flap lever by feel. He clicked it down. "Flaps 25 set." The plane billowed. The wind caught the extra surface area and tossed the nose up. David fought the yoke with both hands, his biceps straining. The hydraulic actuators whined as the massive control surfaces on the wings battled the gale. "Patricia," David said without turning his head, "read the landing checklist." Patricia, strapped into the jump seat behind him, fumbled with the laminated card. Her hands were shaking so bad she dropped it twice. She picked it up, tears blurring her vision. She looked at the back of David's head. This man, whom she had deemed unworthy of a seat, was now wrestling a metal beast to save her life. "Speed brake." "Armed," she read, her voice cracking. "Armed," David confirmed, glancing at the lever. "Landing gear." "Down," she sobbed. "Down and 3 green," David said. The 3 green lights indicated the wheels were locked in place. "Flaps. 30, she read. "Set 30. David commanded. Kenji moved the lever. The noise in the cockpit was deafening. The wind screamed against the windshield wipers, which were slapping frantically back and forth, fighting a losing battle against the deluge. The rain sounded like gravel being thrown against the fuselage. "Lock captured. Glide slope alive," David muttered to himself. They were locked onto the instrument landing system, ILS. An invisible radio beam was guiding them down toward runway 29. David had to keep the needles on his display centered. If he deviated too much, they would hit the rocky hills surrounding the airport. 1,000 feet, the automated voice of the plane announced. Stable. But they weren't stable. The wind shear hit them at 800 feet. The airspeed plummeted from 150 knots to 135 in a second. The stall warning shaker vibrated the control column. Brua brati, warning that the wings were about to stop flying. Power! Kenji shouted blindly. David slammed the throttles forward. The GE-90 engines roared, spooling up with a delay that felt like an eternity. The plane shuddered, sinking rapidly. Come on, come on! David gritted his teeth. The engines caught. The thrust kicked in, slamming them back into their seats. The airspeed climbed. David eased the nose down to regain energy, but the ground was rushing up fast. 500, the computer voice intoned. Runway not in sight, David called out. All he saw was blackness and rain streaking horizontally in the landing lights. Patricia squeezed her eyes shut. She prayed to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. She thought about her arrogance. She thought about Mr. Whitlock in 2A, probably terrified. She thought about the mother in 38C with the teething baby. If David failed, they all died. And it would be because she had treated the only capable pilot on board like garbage, stressing him out before the flight even began. Please let him be good enough, she thought. Please. Approaching minimums, the computer warned. 200 feet. Decision height. If David didn't see the runway lights in the next 2 seconds, he had to abort the landing and go around. But they didn't have enough fuel for a second attempt. The diversion had drained them. 100, the computer said. Lights, David shouted. I have lights. Continuing. Through a break in the squall, a faint row of rabbit lights, the strobe lights leading to the runway, flashed below. They were offset to the right. The wind had blown them sideways. David had to perform a crab landing. He kept the nose of the plane pointed into the wind, almost 30 degrees away from the runway, to fly in a straight line. 50, 40, 30. The runway threshold flashed beneath them. Kick it out, David whispered. At 20 feet above the tarmac, David stomped on the left rudder pedal. The nose of the giant plane swung violently to the left, aligning with the center line. At the same time, he turned the yoke right to keep the upwind wing low. It was a cross-control maneuver that required immense physical strength and split-second timing. Slam! The right main gear hit the runway hard. It wasn't a smooth landing. It was a survival landing. The plane bounced. The struts compressed, and then the left gear slammed down. Spoilers up, reverse thrust, David yelled. He yanked the reverse thrust levers back. The engine cowlings slid open, and the massive fans directed their thrust forward. The roar was apocalyptic. The plane shuddered as it decelerated, fighting the slick, icy runway. Patricia was thrown forward against her harness. The deceleration was brutal. 100 knots, David called. 80 knots. 60 knots. David tapped the brakes gently. The anti-skid system pulsed under his feet. The plane fishtailed slightly on the ice, but he corrected it with masterful precision. Manual braking, he said, his breath coming in heavy gasps inside the oxygen mask. The plane slowed to a crawl. The roar of the engines faded to a whine. They were stopped. David slumped in his seat. His uniform was soaked in sweat. His hands, still gripping the yoke, were trembling from the adrenaline dump. Ladies and gentlemen, he breathed, ripping the mask off his face. We are down. For a moment, there was total silence in the cockpit. Just the sound of the rain hammering the roof and the hum of the avionics cooling fans. Then, from the back of the plane, a sound erupted. It started as a ripple and grew into a roar. Cheering. The passengers were clapping, screaming, crying with relief. They had felt the violence of the approach, the terrified drop, and the sudden safety of the ground. Patricia unbuckled her harness. She stood up on shaky legs. She looked at David. He was staring out the window at the flashing lights of the fire trucks racing toward them. He looked exhausted. He looked older than he had an hour ago. "Captain Sterling," Patricia said, her voice barely a whisper. David didn't look at her. He turned to Kenji. "You okay, son?" "I'm alive, sir," Kenji said, wiping his eyes. "You stuck that landing. I've never seen a crosswind correction like that. Not in this weather. We got lucky," David said humbly. He finally turned to Patricia. Her face was a mask of shock and awe. You saved us." David's expression hardened. The adrenaline was fading, and the memory of the gate at JFK was returning. "Open the door." "Patricia," he said, his voice flat. "Let the paramedics in for Captain Miller, and get the authorities. I have a report to file." The next hour was a blur of red and blue lights. The 777 was towed to a remote de-icing pad, because the gate wasn't equipped for a heavy international arrival at this hour. Stair trucks were rolled up. Canadian paramedics, bundled in heavy yellow parkas, rushed into the cockpit. They carefully extricated Captain Miller, who was now semi-conscious but groggy. They put him on a stretcher and carried him out. Kenji went with them to get his eyes flushed. David stayed behind. As the pilot in command PIC, by virtue of the emergency, he couldn't leave the aircraft until it was secured and handed over to the ground authorities. He stood at the cockpit door, watching the passengers deplane. They filed out slowly, wrapped in blankets the crew had distributed. As they passed the cockpit, they looked inside. They saw the soot on the ceiling. They saw the fire extinguisher powder. And they saw David. "Thank you," the mother from seat 38C said, clutching her sleeping baby. She stopped and grabbed David's hand. "Thank you so much. I thought we were going to die." David smiled tiredly. "It's my job. Mom, go get some rest." "Mr. Whitlock." The man from seat 2A walked by. He looked pale. His arrogance had evaporated. He looked at David, the man whose seat he had stolen, and couldn't meet his eyes. He mumbled a quick thanks and hurried down the stairs. Head down in shame. Finally. The cabin was empty. The cleaners and the fire marshal came on board. Captain Sterling. A tall man in a Royal Canadian Mounted Police RCMP uniform stepped onto the plane, accompanied by a woman in a Transatlantic Airways blazer, the local station manager for St. John's. "I'm Captain Sterling," David said, straightening his tie. "I'm Sergeant Doucette," the officer said. "And this is Mrs. LeBlanc from the airline. We need a statement." "Of course," David said. "Mrs. LeBlanc looked confused. She held a manifest in her hand. "Captain, I'm looking at the crew list. Your name isn't on the operating crew. It says Captain Miller and First Officer Tanaka. You are listed as a passenger seat 38B. David's eyes narrowed. He looked over Mrs. LeBlanc's shoulder and saw Patricia standing in the galley. She was wiping down a counter, trying to look busy, trying to make herself invisible. "That is correct," David said, his voice loud enough for Patricia to hear. "I was deadheading to London. I was assigned seat 38B by the purser. Ms. Holloway. Mrs. LeBlanc frowned. 38B economy. But, Captain, company policy states deadhead crews on international flights must be in business or first for rest requirements, especially a senior Czech airman." "I am aware of the policy," David said coolly. "Ms. Holloway, however, felt that a revenue passenger was more important. She denied me my contractual seat. She explicitly told me to sit in the back. The silence in the galley was thick. Mrs. LeBlanc turned to look at Patricia. Patricia. Mrs. LeBlanc asked, "Is this true? Did you downgrade a captain to economy on a fully booked flight?" Patricia froze. She walked slowly toward them. Her face was pale, her lipstick smudged. The hard karma was starting to circle. I followed protocol." Patricia lied, her voice trembling. "The system showed a double booking. I didn't know he was... I thought." "You thought what?" David interrupted, stepping forward. He wasn't shouting. He was using the calm, authoritative voice he used during flight reviews. "You tore up my boarding pass. You told me. And I quote, 'I don't have time to argue with affirmative action hires.' Do you deny saying that?" Mrs. LeBlanc gasped. The RCMP officer raised an eyebrow, pulling out his notebook. I never used those words," Patricia cried, her defensive walls crumbling. "He's lying. He was being aggressive at the gate. I had to protect the passengers." David reached into his flight bag. He pulled out his iPad. "I don't need to lie, Patricia," David said, "because unlike you, I follow protocol. When I took command of this aircraft, I activated the cockpit voice recorder event marker. But more importantly, the gate agent at JFK, Sarah, she witnessed the entire exchange, and so did the passengers in line." He turned to Mrs. LeBlanc. "And one more thing. When the emergency started, Ms. Holloway did not know the emergency access code to the cockpit. I had to enter it myself. If I hadn't been there, if I had been asleep in the back, or if I had refused to board because of her insult, this plane would be at the bottom of the Atlantic right now." Mrs. LeBlanc's face went stone cold. She looked at Patricia with a mix of disbelief and fury. Transatlantic Airways took safety seriously, but they took PR disasters involving racism and near-fatal crashes even more seriously. "Patricia," Mrs. LeBlanc said, her voice icy, "hand over your badge." "What?" Patricia shrieked. "You can't do that. I just helped land this plane. I read the checklist." "You endangered the flight by denying a pilot his rest," Mrs. LeBlanc said. "And you violated the airline's zero-tolerance policy on discrimination. We will conduct a full investigation. But for now, you are suspended pending inquiry. Badge." "Now." Patricia looked at David. She looked for sympathy. She found none. David stood tall, his 4 stripes gleaming under the cabin lights. He wasn't gloating. He was just correcting an error in the system. And right now, the error was her. "Please," Patricia whispered to David. "I have a mortgage. I have kids. Please don't let them fire me." David looked at her. He thought about the man in the grey tracksuit she had let through. He thought about the affirmative action comment. He thought about the water she had spilled on him. "You should have thought about that at the gate." "Patricia," David said softly. "Character isn't something you show when things are going well. It's what you show when you think no one is watching, and you showed me exactly who you are." He turned his back on her. "Mrs. LeBlanc, I'm ready to go to the hotel now. I believe I'm entitled to a room, or should I sleep in the lobby?" "Mrs. Bohurin." LeBlanc flushed. "Oh, no. Captain, the presidential suite at the Sheraton is reserved for you. The car is waiting." As David walked down the stairs into the freezing Newfoundland night, he took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. Behind him, he heard Patricia sobbing as the RCMP officer asked her to step aside for questioning regarding the cockpit safety breach. He got into the waiting black SUV. He pulled out his phone. He had one call to make. He dialed the number for the chief pilot of Transatlantic Airways in Chicago. "Hello, David." The voice on the other end answered, sleepy and confused. "It's 3 a.m. What's wrong?" "Chief," David said, leaning back in the leather seat. "We have a problem with the culture on the New York line, and I think we need to make some changes. Let me tell you a story." 3 weeks later, the sky over Chicago was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a stark contrast to the nightmare in Newfoundland. But inside the glass-walled headquarters of Transatlantic Airways, the atmosphere was stormier than any hurricane. Captain David Sterling sat at the head of a long mahogany table in boardroom B. He wasn't wearing his uniform today. He was in a sharp, charcoal grey suit. He looked every bit the executive he had been avoiding becoming for years. Opposite him sat a panel of 5 people. The Vice President of Flight Operations, the Director of Human Resources, a union representative, and the Chief Pilot, Captain Richard Thompson. And sitting alone in a chair in the center of the room, looking small and pale, was Patricia Holloway. She wasn't wearing her uniform either. She was wearing a modest dress, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The arrogant smirk was gone. The condescending tilt of her head was gone. She looked like a trapped animal. "This hearing is now in session," Captain Thompson announced, his voice grave. "We are here to review the incidents aboard Flight 299 regarding the conduct of Purser Patricia Holloway and the emergency command assumed by Captain David Sterling." Patricia cleared her throat. "I just want to say, before we start, that my actions were purely in the interest of passenger comfort. I didn't know Captain Sterling was who he was. If I had known he was a Czech airman, I would have—" "You would have what?" David interrupted, his voice calm but cutting through the room like a knife. "You would have treated me with basic human dignity. Is that something reserved only for people with 4 stripes on their shoulders?" "Patricia." Patricia flinched. I was under stress. The flight was overbooked. The HR director, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, adjusted her glasses. "Ms. Holloway, we have reviewed the security footage from the gate at JFK. We have also interviewed Sarah, the gate agent." Patricia's eyes widened. She hadn't expected Sarah to speak up. Sarah was timid. Sarah was new. Patricia had bullied Sarah for months. Sarah stated, "Mrs. Ward, Mia Gable read from a file, that you explicitly overrode the system's must-ride command. She stated that you referred to Captain Sterling as an affirmative action hire within earshot of passengers. Is this true?" "No." Patricia cried, looking at the union rep for support. "That's hearsay. It's her word against mine." "Is it?" David asked. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a handwritten letter. "This was sent to the CEO of Transatlantic Airways 3 days ago," David said. "It's from Mr. Arthur Whitlock, the Diamond Medallion passenger in seat 2A, the man you gave my seat to." Patricia went dead silent. David began to read the letter aloud. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to formally apologize to Captain David Sterling. I was unaware that the seat I occupied was stolen from the pilot who would later save my life. I also want to report the behavior of the purser, Patricia, before takeoff." She made several disparaging remarks about the pilot in the back to me, laughing about how she put him in his place. I was too arrogant to correct her then. But after seeing Captain Sterling land that plane in a blizzard while she panicked, I realized how wrong we both were. She is a liability to your airline. She cares more about status than safety. Signed, Arthur Whitlock. The room was silent. The air conditioning hummed, sounding like a jet engine far away. Patricia's face crumbled. The color drained from her cheeks until she looked like a wax figure. The testimony of a high-value customer was the final nail in the coffin. There was no spinning this. There was no he said, she said. Ms. Holloway, Captain Thompson said, closing the file. Transatlantic Airways prides itself on safety, inclusion, and professionalism. You have violated all three. You endangered a flight by denying a pilot his federally mandated rest. You discriminated against a colleague based on race, and you lied to this inquiry. I have 20 years of service, Patricia sobbed, the tears flowing freely now. You can't do this. I have a pension, I have a reputation. You had a reputation, David corrected her. Captain Thompson looked at the HR director, then back at Patricia. Patricia Holloway, effective immediately, your employment with Transatlantic Airways is terminated for gross misconduct. You are stripped of all seniority and benefits. Terminated, she gasped. But I can transfer to Delta or United. David leaned forward. This was the moment. The hard karma wasn't just losing the job. It was losing the lifestyle she used to look down on others. Patricia, David said softly, when a flight crew member is terminated for safety violations and discrimination, it goes into the PRIA database, the Pilot Records Improvement Act. Every airline in the country checks that database before hiring. You will never work on a commercial aircraft again. Not as a purser, not as a flight attendant, not even as a gate agent. Patricia looked at him with horror. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her career was over. The travel, the hotels, the power trips. It was all gone. Please, she whispered. I'm sorry. David. Please. David stood up. He buttoned his jacket. It's Captain Sterling, he said, and I don't hold grudges. Patricia, I just fly the plane. You're the one who decided to crash. He turned and walked out of the boardroom. 6 months later, David stood in the terminal at Heathrow Airport in London. He had just flown the red-eye from New York. He was tired, but it was a good tired. He had recently been promoted to chief pilot of the entire Atlantic Division. He was now responsible for 400 pilots and the culture of the entire fleet. He walked toward the exit, his flight bag rolling behind him. He stopped at a coffee shop near the arrivals hall to grab an espresso. As he waited for his drink, he saw a woman wiping down the tables. She was wearing a generic, ill-fitting grey uniform of a third-party cleaning contractor. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. She looked tired, her hands red from the sanitizer. She turned to spray the next table and froze. It was Patricia. She was working for a cleaning service at the airport. It was the only job she could get in the industry after being blacklisted. She looked at David. She looked at his 4 gold stripes, his crisp hat, the respect the other travelers gave him as they moved out of his way. David looked at her. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded a small, professional acknowledgement of another human being. Patricia looked down at her spray bottle, shame burning her face. She turned away, unable to meet his gaze, and started scrubbing a coffee stain off the table. David picked up his espresso. He took a sip, adjusted his bag, and walked out into the London morning. The sky was clear, the wind was calm, and the flight was on time. Karma had landed. And there you have it, folks. That is the incredible, true-to-life story of how Captain David Stirling turned a moment of humiliation into a masterclass in professionalism. It's a powerful reminder that you should never judge a book by its cover or a pilot by their seat assignment. Patricia thought she held all the power because she stood at the gate. But when the storm hit, the only power that mattered was the skill to save lives. She learned the hard way that arrogance is a heavy bag to carry, and eventually you have to check it. I want to know what you think. Have you ever dealt with a Patricia in your life? Someone who tried to use their small amount of power to make you feel small. How did you handle it? Did karma ever come back to bite them? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more dramas about justice, karma, and the wild world of aviation, please do me a huge favor. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a flight with us. Until next time, keep your seatbelts fastened and your karma clean. Thanks for watching.